62 feet. That's how deep through waterlogged peat and soft clay you had to dig before hitting solid rock beneath the Chicago riverfront in 1920. And on that swamp, William Wrigley Jr. demanded a skyscraper, not in 5 years, not in 3, but in 18 months. No hydraulic cranes, no modern equipment. The workers who built the Wrigley Building drove 28 pneumatic caissons to bedrock with compressed air and muscle, erected steel through brutal winters above the Chicago River, and clad the tower in 250,000 pieces of glazed terracotta, 3.4 million man-hours of labor. Almost none of their names survive. What they faced beneath that riverbank is where this story begins. William Wrigley Jr. wanted more than a headquarters. He wanted a monument that would anchor a new Chicago. In 1920, as the city's North Riverbank still oozed with mud and the Michigan Avenue Bridge was barely finished, Wrigley summoned the city's top architects and laid down a deadline that bordered on the impossible: 18 months to build a skyscraper where most men would not risk a 2-story house. The press called it a dare to gravity and common sense. Wrigley's vision was as much about civic pride as it was about business. He saw Michigan Avenue not as a street, but as a future boulevard of marble and light, a rival to Fifth Avenue in New York. The city's leaders were eager to erase the memory of the Great Fire and the patchwork of factories and warehouses that lined the river. Wrigley's building would be the first beacon in a campaign to transform the industrial riverfront into a grand public promenade. The commission went to Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White, Burnham's successors and the city's most ambitious designers. They were told no delays, no excuses. The 18-month target for the South Tower was non-negotiable. Wrigley wanted his building open by the next spring, in time for the city's annual business convention. This meant working through winter, through mud, and through every technical obstacle the riverbank could throw at them. The architects drew up plans that combined the latest in steel frame engineering with a bold Beaux-Arts facade. But even on paper, the timeline looked reckless. Newspapers ran breathless updates on the project, framing it as a contest between Wrigley's willpower and Chicago's notorious ground. The city's planning department, still stung by recent construction delays elsewhere on Michigan Avenue, signed off on expedited permits. Wrigley personally reviewed contractor bids, insisting on penalties for every week lost. The message was clear. This was not just another office tower. It was a civic mandate, a statement that Chicago could build faster, higher, and with more style than any city in America. The urgency became part of the building's identity. Shift schedules were drawn to keep work going around the clock. Material suppliers were warned that a single missed delivery could stall the entire project. The architects and engineers knew that every day counted and every setback would be public. Underneath the promotional language and architectural renderings lurked the real challenge: how to raise a skyscraper on ground that barely supported its own weight, and to do it at a speed that left no margin for error. That technical riddle would soon fall to the workers in the mud and the men with the airlocks. But the relentless pace and ambition began with Wrigley's demand: 18 months or nothing. Beneath Michigan Avenue, the ground offered little comfort to anyone hoping to build. In 1919, municipal boring logs revealed an unstable layered mess: 5 to 10 feet of black peat, soft and saturated, then 20 feet of silty clay, loose and waterlogged. Below that was a jumbled fill of brick fragments, rotted wood, and remnants of an old dock, none of it stable. True support lay far below, in dolomitic limestone sloping away from the river, averaging 62 feet down, sometimes dipping to 70 feet. The city inspectors called it a floating island, soil that shifted with the seasons, especially when the river swelled and forced water up through the clay. This was not just mud. It was a living, shifting hazard. Old warehouses along the river had sunk year after year, their walls cracking as piling slipped deeper into the muck. Even the Michigan Avenue Bridge, finished just months before, needed emergency underpinning after its east abutment shifted during a thaw. The Wrigley Building would be heavier than anything north of the river, and the ground seemed determined to swallow it whole. No ordinary foundation could stand a chance. Engineers pored over the boring logs, searching for a solution. The only reliable support was the dolomite bedrock, hard and ancient, but buried so deep that traditional masonry footings were impossible. The answer was caissons, airtight shafts lined with timber or steel, sunk through the unstable layers to rest directly on bedrock. Each caisson had to reach at least 60 feet, some as deep as 68 feet, to guarantee stability. Water complicated every step. The river pressed in, threatening to flood the shafts and collapse the excavation. Dewatering pumps ran constantly, but a single failure could turn a work pit into a mud-filled trap. City inspectors tracked every inch of progress. They measured caisson depths with weighted lines, logging each advance in the official ledger. Records from January 1921 show a typical caisson hit hard rock at 62 feet, give or take 4 feet. Anything less, and the crew kept digging, no matter the hour. For workers, it meant long shifts in airlocks, shoveling clay in darkness, always aware that the ground above could shift without warning. The earth fought every advance. Only by reaching bedrock could the foundation resist the river's push and the city's restless soil. The caisson grid became the building's silent spine, anchoring ambition where the ground itself refused to yield. Building on Chicago's riverbank meant facing down 30 feet of unstable peat and clay before even thinking about skyscraper weight. The solution was 28 timber-sheathed pneumatic caissons, each a 12 by 12 foot box, driven through muck until they hit dolomitic limestone, sometimes 68 feet below street level. These caissons were not just shafts, they were sealed, pressurized chambers where crews worked in air thick with the scent of wet timber and sweat, cut off from the city above. Foundations. To keep the river at bay, compressors forced air into each caisson at up to 30 pounds per square inch, enough to press on eardrums and make every breath feel weighted. Workers entered through steel airlocks, boots scraping across planks slick with clay. Inside, shovels and pneumatic air spades tore through the soil. Every load of spoil was hauled out by a steam-powered hoist, its piston hammering day and night, lifting barrels of clay up the shaft, swinging them to dump carts, and lowering empty buckets back down. The routine was relentless: dig, fill, hoist, repeat. In the softest layers, steam-driven suction buckets and percussion drills chewed through peat and silt, sometimes advancing 1.5 feet per day if the ground held. Pressure. When a caisson hit sand or the river forced its way in, air pressure climbed beyond 30 pounds per square inch, and extra timber shoring was jammed in to hold the walls. Blowouts were a constant threat. In early 1921, newspapers reported 3 separate floods in the shafts, crews scrambling for safety as engineers sealed breaches with fresh timber and surges of compressed air. Each time, work resumed within a day. Blowouts above ground, reciprocating steam pumps kept the pits dry, moving over 6,000 gallons of water away daily. Inspectors tracked progress with weighted lines, logging each advance in city records. If a caisson did not reach bedrock, digging continued around the clock. Only when the timber ring at the base rested on stone did the foundation pour begin, a rush of concrete and steel locking the shaft in place and channeling the building's weight straight down to ancient rock. Bedrock. By the end, the grid beneath the Wrigley Building was a network of silent anchors, each shaped by sweat, steam, and the refusal to let the river win. Pneumatic caissons turned Chicago's worst ground into a foundation strong enough for a skyscraper. Anchors. The Wrigley Building's foundations began with men whose names filled the city's payroll ledgers: Kowalski, Romano, O'Connor, Rossi. They came from Poland, Italy, Ireland, Slovakia, most arriving with little English, hired by union stewards or by word of mouth. For $4.25 a day, they stepped into the caissons, timber-lined shafts sunk between the river and 60 feet of clay, sealed from daylight by steel airlocks and the hiss of compressors. Each shift meant 10 hours underground, 6 days a week, in air thick with pressure and the constant threat of water breaking through. Michel Rossi from Genoa joined after his cousin vouched for him. His morning started before dawn, boots crunching over mud, a lunch pail packed with bread and cheese. Rossi's crew, 30 men at a time, rotated shifts, their world reduced to the press of air on their lungs and the slow ooze of clay underfoot. The steam hoist rattled above, hauling barrels of muck to the surface, while water seeped in through every crack. Some men prayed before entering the airlock, others swapped stories about home or argued over whose boots leaked worst. In January 1921, payroll records listed over 1,100 laborers on foundation work, nearly 80% born outside the United States. Skilled foremen like Mike O'Connor from County Cork earned $6.75 a day, but even they took their turn in the mud. The schedule was relentless. If a caisson hit sand or the river forced its way in, the crew worked through the night, shoring up walls with fresh timber, hoping the air pumps would hold. On payday, men lined up at a makeshift table, pay envelopes checked against the ledger. Most sent money home to families in Naples, Krakow, Galway, or paid rent for crowded rooms nearby. Yet pride ran deep. Rossi told his son the Wrigley job was the hardest he'd ever known, but the most important. "We built it right through the river," he said, "and the city saw us do it." 18 months, no excuses. The pressure never let up. Crew bosses tracked every lost hour, every leak, knowing a single missed shift could throw off the schedule. When the grid was finished, the caisson men moved on, leaving the building's weight resting on their labor, sunk deep into the riverbank by sweat and stubborn will. The Wrigley Building site operated under constant pressure, boxed in by the river and Michigan Avenue, with barely enough space to turn around, let alone store supplies. Every inch mattered. There was no lay-down yard, no extra room for stockpiling. The daily limit was set, 1,000 tons of material, tracked in ledgers that rivaled any railroad schedule. Steel from Gary, terracotta from Zanesville, sand from Humboldt Park. Each shipment had a precise arrival time, and missing it meant chaos. The dock scheduling team, led by John K. Murphy, worked in shifts to keep the flow unbroken. Barges slid into the river dock, squeezed between ferries and coal scows, their cargoes offloaded by cranes perched on makeshift timber piers. Rail cars rumbled in before dawn, their contents needed almost as soon as they arrived. There was no margin for error. If a barge was late or a rail car missed its slot, the site would grind to a halt. The dock ledger became the Bible of the operation, listing origins, weights, and times in thick pencil. Murphy's crew checked it each morning, steel at 6:15, terracotta by 9 o'clock, sand trucks between 10 and noon. The schedule was unforgiving, enforced by the city's fire marshal and the hard realities of the cramped lot. Only a day's worth of steel could be stacked. Terracotta tiles, fragile and hand-glazed, moved from crate to scaffold almost instantly. Dock workers signaled with flags and whistles, threading beams through a maze of crates while iron workers waited above. The supply chain ran as tight as the rivets holding the frame together. Each delivery had to fit the build sequence exactly, no room for improvisation. As the building rose, the choreography grew more complex. The dock team synchronized with crane operators and rivet gangs, timing beams and panels to arrive in the order needed. Terracotta followed the mason's pace, never ahead, never behind. Every worker depended on this invisible current of materials flowing through the site with no pause. The project's speed wasn't just manpower or willpower. It was the discipline of a supply chain run with railroad precision. Every day, a race against the river, the mud, and the clock. 3.5 million man-hours compressed into just 18 months, built the Wrigley Building from river mud to gleaming tower. The number is staggering, but its meaning was felt in the relentless pace on site. Payroll ledgers show men averaging 70 hours a week, overtime a fact of life. Progress charts, still archived, mark the advance floor by floor, steel rising at a story every 6 days, terracotta crews close behind, each team racing its own clock. At the project's peak, over 1,200 men crowded the site. Caisson diggers worked below the river, steel workers bolted beams overhead, laborers hauled crates of tile and brick up makeshift lifts. Every shift was a vital link, and if one crew slipped, the schedule threatened to unravel. The pressure was constant, not just from foremen, but from the work itself. Snow, sleet, and the river's damp chill seeped into every hour. Shifts stretched from dawn to dark, weeks blurring into cycles of fatigue and return. A caisson digger might log 10-hour days, 6 days straight, then hand off to a steel rigger working by lantern light through the night. The pace was unyielding. The steel skeleton alone consumed over 600,000 man-hours, with rivet gangs setting up to 1,200 hot rivets a day. Terracotta masons balanced on swinging scaffolds laid more than 1,000 tiles daily, each checked for alignment. Deliveries arrived in tight windows, and if a barge missed its slot, men waited, pay docked, hours lost. Foremen filed weekly reports to Wrigley's office, tracking hours, floors, and delays. Penalties for falling behind were real, and pride in keeping pace ran deep. For many immigrant workers, Poles, Italians, Irish, Slovaks, each hour was both a wage and a wager. The promise of steady work drew men from across the city, but the cost was measured in strained backs, split hands, and crowded boarding houses. Still, the job's rhythm became its own order. Stories were traded on scaffolds, bread shared in the shadow of the rising frame. The Wrigley Building's speed was more than engineering, it was collective will, a test of how much could be given for progress. The clock never stopped, and neither did the workers. Steel shipments arrived before sunrise, and by the time the city was waking up, derricks were already at work. These were not the fixed cranes of later eras, but traveling machines, massive arms mounted on rails, pivoting across the half-built frame. Each operator watched for the right signal, a flag, a whistle, a wave. One wrong move could send a 20-ton beam swinging over the heads of 100 men. The sequence was tight. As soon as a beam cleared the barge, it rose, guided by taglines, then settled into place with barely an inch to spare. Iron workers bolted it down fast, boots ringing against steel, while the derrick swung back for another load. But the real rhythm came from the rivet gangs. Every new floor meant 1,000 holes to fill. Each demanded a red-hot rivet, hammered home before it cooled. The heater, stationed by a portable furnace, pulled glowing rivets with tongs and tossed them up to the catcher, who snatched them from the air with a gloved hand. In one motion, the rivet was jammed into place. Two hammermen, one inside, one out, drove it shut with pneumatic guns. Manuals called it the Chicago method, quick, relentless, and loud. A skilled gang could set more than 1,000 rivets in a single shift. The sound echoed off the river and down Michigan Avenue, a volley of metallic bursts, day and night. Each man had a job. The heater worked closest to the fire, his face streaked with soot. The catcher's gloves were thick leather, sometimes patched with wire. The bucker-up crouched inside the frame, bracing a heavy bar against the cooling rivet, while the hammerman outside delivered blow after blow. The signalman kept the operation moving, eyes fixed on the derrick, ready to halt the lift if anything went wrong. A missed signal could mean disaster, a dropped rivet burning through a boot, or a beam crashing down. Progress showed in leaps. Each week another floor appeared, columns, beams, and bracing locked into a growing grid. Derricks rolled forward, rails extended by hand. Rivet gangs kept pace, their cadence setting the tempo for everyone else. Even as winter winds cut across the river, the work never stopped. The Wrigley Building's rise was a mechanical ballet, driven by signals, sweat, and trust. The rivet gang's rhythm, 1,000 rivets a day, became the building's heartbeat, echoing skyward with every new story. 250,000 tiles, each cast, glazed, and fired at the Northwestern Terracotta Company, arrived in numbered crates along the Chicago River. These weren't mere ornaments. Every piece, from 6-inch squares at street level to 12-foot cornices above the clock tower, fit a precise slot in the architect's plan. The cladding's gradient, shifting from soft gray at the base to a brilliant white at the summit, echoed the White City's glow and demanded exacting placement. Terracotta setters, many drawn from Italian and Eastern European guilds, worked high above the water, balancing on swinging scaffolds. Chalk lines and the rhythm of the steel frame guided their hands as they set each tile. The anchoring system, hidden metal shelf angles and clips, let the tiles hang like scales and flex with the building as it settled. In the biting wind, masons checked every anchor twice before sliding tiles into place, tapping them flush so the surface ran true despite shifting steel and unpredictable weather. At peak, crews set over 1,000 tiles daily. Each crate held a new challenge, a curved corner, a keystone, a band of molding that had to align perfectly. Mistakes meant delays, and the schedule left no margin for error. Manufacturer records show the factory running double shifts, firing tiles day and night, while ledgers tracked every shipment from rail yard to river dock. No other Chicago building had attempted a terracotta skin at this scale or speed. For the masons, pride lived in the finish. They could point to a bay and recall the tiles they had set. The curve coaxed into place, the anchor tightened against the wind. The Wrigley Building's luminous facade became a gallery of anonymous craftsmanship, each tile a quiet record of steady hands and sharp eyes, racing time and weather to create a new kind of city landmark. Beneath the Wrigley Building, the earth pressed back against every advance. Caisson crews dropped into shafts braced with timber and steel, 30 pounds of air pressure holding the river at bay. The risk was constant, written into muscle and bone. 7 men fell to decompression sickness, caisson disease, struck by headaches, joint pain, and sometimes paralysis. Dr. Joseph Mason, the site's physician, kept a careful log, each entry marking another life changed. The decompression chamber was small, the hours inside long, and recovery never guaranteed. For some, a single mistake underground meant the end of a career, or worse. Above, iron workers battled a different enemy. Winter in 1921 brought temperatures below zero, the river wind slicing through coats and gloves. Frostbite became routine. 12 cases filled Dr. Mason's records that season. Men hammered steel with numb hands, boots slipping on ice-slick beams, snow swirling around them as they balanced crates and riveted girders. There were no harnesses, no safety nets, just a rope at the waist and the hope that your partner's grip would hold. Every step on the scaffolding was a wager against the cold and the wind. Accidents came without warning. A missed signal, a frozen hand, a slip on a wet plank. Routine could turn to disaster in seconds. The medical tent, pitched in the mud, rarely saw a quiet moment. Dr. Mason treated crushed fingers, broken ribs, and the coughs that lingered from coal smoke and river mist. Some men returned after a day or two. Others never came back, their names quietly erased from the payroll. The relentless schedule left no time for healing. Each shift pressed forward day and night. The city's ambition was measured not just in stories built, but in the scars and silence left behind. The Wrigley Building's beauty was bought with sweat, pain, and lives forever altered. As the South Tower neared completion, the project's next phase demanded a new kind of coordination. The North Annex, destined to double the building's footprint, couldn't simply follow the same breakneck pace. By 1922, Michigan Avenue was busier, and the city was less willing to tolerate round-the-clock noise on its new civic showpiece. The annex would rise in a series of carefully timed pushes, each one squeezed between office hours, traffic surges, and the city's evolving rules for night work. Permit archives show that the North Annex received its own building authorization in late 1922, with a strict timeline for completion by spring 1924. But the city's Department of Buildings, wary of complaints from nearby hotels and businesses, granted only limited night work permits. Crews were allowed to operate between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., a narrow window that forced contractors to rethink every stage. Material deliveries were rescheduled for after midnight, and steam hoists fired up long after the streetcars had stopped running. Iron workers and masons found themselves working by lantern light, balancing on beams above a silent river while the rest of the city slept. City permit officials became regulars on site, tracking compliance and fielding noise complaints. Contractors kept meticulous logs, noting every hour worked under the special permit. The scheduling challenge was as much political as logistical. Too much noise and the city could pull the permit. Too little progress and the project would miss its promised debut. The planners from Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White met weekly with city inspectors to negotiate work slots, sometimes trading daytime deliveries for extra hours at night. The annex's construction became a civic compromise, an exercise in fitting monumental ambition into the rhythms of a growing city. The phased schedule meant that the North Annex opened in May 1924, nearly 3 years after the South Tower's first tenants moved in. But the result was a unified facade, a seamless expansion that preserved the building's place at the heart of Michigan Avenue. The last logistical hurdles had been cleared not just by muscle and machinery, but by a careful dance with City Hall, proving that even in an era of rapid progress, every landmark was shaped by negotiation as much as by steel and stone. By the time the Wrigley Building's white towers reached their full height, Chicago's newspapers were running out of superlatives. Headlines called it the jewel of the new avenue and a miracle in stone and steel. The city's columnists marveled at the speed, 18 months from river mud to clock tower, and at the audacity of putting such a monument on ground that had swallowed lesser buildings. Editorials in the Chicago Tribune and Daily News described the project as a civic dare, proof that Chicago's will could outpace both nature and rival cities. Photographs of the completed facade, gleaming above the river, were splashed across front pages. The building's opening drew crowds to Michigan Avenue, where people pressed against streetcar rails to glimpse the marble lobby and the clock faces shining high above the bridge. Storefronts nearby began to change too. Land that had once been home to warehouses and coal yards was suddenly value. Real estate advertisements boasted of Wrigley proximity and promised that Michigan Avenue was now the city's grandest address. The building's electric lights, switched on at dusk, washed the riverbank in a glow that drew evening strollers and inspired the first nighttime photographs of the new skyline. It wasn't just the press that felt the impact. Merchants and hotel owners up and down the avenue credited the building with turning a neglected stretch of the city into a destination. The phrase, "Magnificent Mile," began to appear in booster pamphlets and city planning documents, each one pointing to the Wrigley Building as the catalyst. The city's architectural critics, usually quick to find fault, praised the building's white terracotta and its Beaux-Arts silhouette, calling it a worthy rival to anything on Fifth Avenue or the Champs-Élysées. But beneath the celebration, the workers themselves knew what had been risked and spent. The immigrant laborers, the iron workers, the tile setters, all could point to the tower and say, "We built that." Their effort had turned a patch of unstable riverbank into the cornerstone of a new Chicago. The city's headlines captured the pride, but the legacy was written in sweat, in the hours logged, and the hands that set each stone. The Wrigley Building stood as a monument not just to ambition or money, but to the thousands who made the impossible real. It sounds impossible. An ornate tower pulled from mud in just 18 months without modern machines, by hands that history rarely names. Yet every time the Wrigley Building catches the sun, It is a monument to the scale of what workers can will into being, even against absurd odds. In today's rush to automate, their legacy insists that progress still carries the imprint of human ambition, grit, and risk. Their story endures, written in steel and stone.